Greetings, and welcome to the lecture about antecedents to psychology for the capstone course at Boise State University. My name is Dr. Eric Landrum, so let's go ahead and get started. To be honest, it's actually a very subjective decision about when to start discussing the history of psychology and its beginning points. We could certainly go more backward in time to start this, but as you'll see, we're going to start somewhere around 500 BC. But before we do that, let me lay the foundation and discuss briefly some different approaches to studying the history of psychology. It's a very common approach to study systems or schools of thought in psychology. These are different types of subject matter, methodological assumptions that are made at different eras within the development of psychology, or it could adhere to a certain philosophy or a theorist who is the main proponent. Typically, we might think of these as isms, and actually, as we go through the lectures in this course, you'll hear about structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, neo-behaviorism, and the like. And so that's a very common approach. A number of different history and systems textbooks within psychology are actually organized around that framework. And so this kind of schools of thought or major, big, broad theoretical approach is certainly one method to approaching the history of psychology. You have to remember, though, is that we are extracting a very narrow swath of the history of the world and humanity when we talk about the history of psychology. And what I'm trying to say here is that the history of psychology occurs in the context of the history of everything else that's going on in the world around us. And so, for example, we will consider political and social influences from time to time. So, for instance, Freud's timing at the turn of the century between the 1800s and 1900s, the political and social influences at that time kind of all converge and allow him to become as popular as he did. World War I and World War I and World War II have considerable impact on the development of the history of psychology in terms of the need for psychologists and the need for training. In fact, I think a number of students may not realize that clinical psychology, of which is a very stereotypical thought about psychologists today, that we're all clinicians and counselors, but clinical psychology does not get a major emphasis and start in this country until 1945 in the aftermath of World War II and millions of soldiers coming home from World War II and needing psychological assistance as well as physical rehabilitation. And so world events in the United States are going to play a huge impact in impacting the history and development and systems that emerge in psychology. Just another kind of dichotomy that's typically discussed, probably more by historians than someone teaching a course like I am, is that you can take a personalistic versus a naturalistic. And so the personalistic is eponymic. And so an eponymic approach would be to study names and dates. And so you could memorize a bunch of names and dates, and you could memorize the birth and death of Sigmund Freud or John Watson or B.F. Skinner or Wilhelm Wundt or whatever. And so you could take that personalistic stories, biography type of approach, an eponymic approach, versus what's called a naturalistic approach. You see a word there in parentheses here. I can highlight it for you here with the mouse. Zeitgeist. And zeitgeist is a German word. And if you were to literally translate zeitgeist, it would be time ghost. However, we don't usually, when we think about zeitgeist, we don't usually think about time ghost, but the phrase is spirit of the times. And so there are certain eras or approaches that are popular at one time, but had an arc. That is, they didn't exist, they started, they became popular, they faded, and now there may be little to no residue of their impact in psychology. And so a zeitgeist approach talks about timing, about the confluence of events and theoretical ideas to make the timing just right. And so you've heard the phrase, perhaps, sometimes a person will have an idea before its time. That means that the zeitgeist wasn't right. The timing wasn't right. It might be a great idea, but it just wasn't timed well. People weren't ready for it. It was too controversial or too radical or just too advanced. And so those are two major approaches. And so to To be honest with you, it'll be a blend of both in this course. And so we will focus on some names and some dates, not a lot about the dates per se, but a chronological approach. But we'll also talk about timing and the zeitgeist, and we'll talk about how some ideas emerged and became popular, and other ones, for whatever reason, just didn't have much traction in psychology. So anyway, that's kind of a big, broad overview of different approaches to studying the history of psychology. And I think a very natural question to ask is why bother? I mean, why bother in this capstone course studying the history of psychology? And I think I can give you at least two really good reasons. A famous researcher from the memory literature in psychology, nonsense syllables, and the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is another German psychologist, Hermann Ebbinghaus, who in 1885 published a very famous journal article on memory. Actually, I take that back. It wasn't a journal article. It was a book. Über das Gedächtnis was its German title. Hopefully you're now dutifully impressed. And one of the famous quotes out of Hermann Ebbinghaus is what you see here: psychology has a long past but a short history. And so an interest in human behavior and human beings has existed since the time of human beings. And so psychology has a long past, but the scientific study of that has a relatively short history. And so, to be honest with you, I would imagine that this is probably indirectly or directly one of the reasons you're a psychology major. What could possibly be more interesting and more fascinating than our own behavior? And so as long as there's been humans, there have been people interested in human behavior. And so that's the long past part of it. But again, we're going to formally and officially put a stamp of the start date of psychology of 1879. And so that's 130 some years of a history of psychology. That's pretty short compared to the history of biology, the history of chemistry, the history of physics, and so forth. And so we have a long past, but a short history. I think another good reason to not only study the history of psychology, but just to study history in general, is that another psychologist who said this in 1905, George Santayana, who said those who cannot remember the past are doomed to repeat it. And so we learn from our past, we learn from our progress in the past and our mistakes in the past. And so we see this on a small scale in psychology writing, psychology literature reviews, where you review what's come before you pitch a new study that you might have done in research methods or writing about in a different type of class. So obviously we have this, hearkening back to the past and understanding the context of where we are today, but also on a more macro level in terms of world events and phenomena that have occurred. We need to remember the past, whether that be the Holocaust, whether that be abuses of humans in terms of research. I can think of some of the stuff that the Nazi doctors did, Nuremberg trial type stuff. You can think of Tuskegee Airmen and the abuses that were made there in the United States and Alabama in the 50s and 60s, continuing on for decades, by the way. And so it's important to remember the past so that we can learn from it, so that we can benefit from the positive events, and we can learn to avoid future negative events. And so I think there really is a context for why it's important for us to study not only history, but the history of psychology. So as anyone would look at a review or their teaching or expertise in terms of the history of psychology, it's a fairly arbitrary choice as to where to start. And so as we start thinking about early philosophical ideas that led to the development of psychology as its own separate discipline, a different person teaching the course might go back much further than 437 BC in the birth of Plato. So just be aware, depending on the textbook that you're reading or the person that you're listening to, it could have an earlier start. It could even have a later start. And so, again, it is relatively arbitrary. And perhaps Plato's greatest contribution, at least in the development of the history of psychology, would be the contributions of his student Aristotle. And so other philosophers in this area, of which, to be honest with you, I am not an expert in philosophy, would call Aristotle the greatest mind in the history of thought. And just to give you two very brief examples of how some of his ideas have trickled down into psychology and the psychological literature. For example, tabula rasa, which is probably a phrase that you've heard at least at some point, I hope, in a course before this capstone course, which translates into blank slate. And so some theories of psychology down through the ages have had this idea that we are born as blank slates, as tabula rasas. And therefore, it's not so much a hereditary influence, but it's much more an environmental influence. And so, how you're raised, the environment, the parental choices, schooling, peers, that blank slate is then written upon, so to speak, by the behaviors and experiences that you have in the environment. I would imagine that most psychologists do not completely hold to that, although there's probably some that do. And so that's an early philosophical idea that continues to influence psychology from the time of Aristotle. And another idea is this notion of an active mind. And rather than being a passive recipient or a vessel that's just receiving inputs from the world around us, Aristotle did propose, in which psychology would have adopted, at least to some extent, this notion of active mind. And you can see in my PowerPoint slide here, MIB, and you're trying to think, well, what does that acronym stand for? And I don't remember the acronym from any psychology textbook. No, that acronym stands for Men in Black. And I don't know if you remember Men in Black, but there's a scene in there where they're in the morgue, they're examining this guy on the table, they flip a switch behind the guy's ear, the face opens up on a hinge, and there's a little guy with knobs and levers and pulleys who seem to be operating the entire brain and body. And so that's that notion of an active mind. Not necessarily there's a man within the man or that kind of thing, a controller, a puppeteer, a marionette type of situation, but that we actively impinge and interact with the world around us. It's an active system, not a passive system. And so that notion of active mind, which I like from Men in Black, actually originates with Aristotle and has some impact on the history of psychological theories and the development of psychology. Just early philosophical ideas, and this is a whirlwind historical view. Again, we could spend the entire semester talking about, everything leading up to the founding of psychology in 1879 by Wilhelm Wundt. In fact, we could argue about that starting date and time, and some historians in psychology actually do have that discussion from time to time. But we're just kind of trying to set the context. This is kind of the backstory. We're kind of setting up the backstory before the plot emerges and before we have the conflict and the resolution to this story. So, if you look at early philosophical ideas from about 300 BC to about 400 AD, Aristotle's ideas are generally accepted by the church. The church at the time is really a dynamic influence in people's lives. People tend to abide by church doctrine and ideas. To be honest with you, if someone was wondering about something and how the world worked, a very common place to get answers would be to go to church and ask the ask the clergyman, how does the world work? And so rather than to go out and seek out that information on one's own, the typical response would be to rely on the church. In fact, the idea then was that men and women want to know about God and soul and not much else. And then around the 1600s, we start to see the emergence of different ideas, different perspectives, some of which are accepted by the church and some are rejected. And, there are classic stories that you can read about, for example, Galileo eventually, being asked to renounce his beliefs and being, pursued by the church and punished and all that. And so this new science, the scientific revolution, begins to take some momentum into the 1600s. So again, I'm kind of cherry picking. I'm trying to just give you some great examples to hang your hat on and to kind of frame things. And so a guy named Sir Francis Bacon comes along and asks a question: how many teeth does a jackass have? And a jackass is a male donkey. And so that's not a pejorative term. At least we use it now as pejorative, but it really isn't as it was originally intended. And so Sir Francis Bacon comes along and says, how many teeth does a jackass have? Now, you and I looking at that, well, I guess in this century, what we would do is that we would go do a Google search. But if we didn't have the internet, what we might think about doing is either going and finding a jackass and carefully counting its teeth, or have someone else do that for us. And so we would actually go out and observe. That's a very natural, typical reaction to this type of question that we understand as answerable. That would not have been the typical response of someone in the 1600s or pre-1600s to have the answer to that question. And so the typical things would be one would consult the clergy. They would be the authority figure at the time. There weren't any books to go to look this up. There was no internet. There probably weren't a lot of experts around and available and traveling to be able to answer questions like that. There probably were no guest lectures to attend. And so the two typical ways that you would answer a very practical question like that would be consult the clergy, who were clearly the authority figures at the time for knowledge in the distribution of information. But the second would be to reason it out philosophically, to hypothesize. And so to be honest with this, you might take your finger and you might count your own number of teeth. You might estimate that a jackass's mouth and facial structure is somewhat larger, so they're going to have more teeth. And so you would kind of do the armchair quarterbacking, I shouldn't say very, but relatively passive. I'm going to go ask somebody for the answer, or I'm going to try to figure it out on my own by looking at my own teeth. Or maybe you have a dog or a cat, and so maybe a jackass's mouth is twice the size of a dog's mouth. You count the number of teeth in a dog, and then you multiply by 2. But the typical approach before the scientific revolution would not have been to go out and observe it. And one of the ideas that Sir Francis Bacon posited and also popularized was this notion of an empirical approach, a research-based approach. So if we want to know how many teeth a jackass has, we go out and we observe. We find a jackass, we gently open its mouth, and we carefully count the number of teeth. And that seems so intuitive to you and to I. To you and to me. To you and to I. That's interesting. That seems so intuitive to you and me, but it would have been unheard of in the 1600s. And it might have been, in some corners, to have been sacrilegious. Why would you stop relying on the church for your information? Why would you go and do such a thing? And so that intuitive approach that we have was actually, at one time, not that intuitive. Just continuing on our whirlwind tour here of early philosophical ideas. From that 1600s to the 1800s, we start to have not only the scientific revolution, but we are on the beginnings, at least in the 1800s, of the Industrial Revolution in terms of these world events. And the zeitgeist at the time, the kind of major theoretical approach, or the spirit of the times, if you will, would have been mechanism or determinism. And so trying to understand how things work. And so trying to understand not only how the world works and how the body works, but also to understand, to be able to manufacture a clock or to print a book in the printing press in Gutenberg. And this kind of mechanistic approach, understanding pieces and parts and how they fit together and how they can work, as well as understanding this notion of cause and effect, determinism, this notion of that there are causes in the world, so effects. And so, for example, if you look at the history of medical science and you go back, you can find all kinds of odd and unusual things. If you look at the beginnings of psychiatry, for example, you'll see things like trephinning, and that's like opening and putting holes in the brain, or bloodletting, in the belief that there was a cause and effect. So if you did something, you could, relieve someone's discomfort, or you could cure a disease. And so that's that spirit of the times. René Descartes comes along, who lives from 1596 to 1650, and really is credited as the founder, or one of the founders, of what we would call modern science today. In terms of psychological influences and perspectives, he comes along and asks some classic questions. And so are the mind and the body one thing, or are they two different things? And so is one mind the same thing? Is it synonymous, or are they different? And if they're different, does the mind influence the body, or does the body influence the mind? And so, what happens is that as we advance our knowledge in the history of psychology, as well as psychology in general, we have a pretty good understanding that it's a two-way street. And so your mind can influence your body, and your thoughts can lead to physiological reactions. And physiological reactions in your body can certainly influence our cognitive processes. And so Rene Descartes comes along and has this very important impact in the history and the development of psychological thought. And of course, Rene Descartes is famous for his quote, "Cogito ergo sum," which translates, "I think, therefore I am." So you have to remember that philosophers are very much interested in these big, broad notions. And so, one of the ideas that this comes from is that if you have to think about, well, do I really exist? Do I really only exist in my mind? Do I exist on this plane or in this universe, but there are other planes and other universes or galaxies? And so, as a philosophical approach, Descartes answers this, "I think, therefore I am." And so that's his way of justifying, well, I do exist because I have the ability to think. So cogito ergo sum, very famous quote from Descartes and from psychology, the history of psychology, as well as from philosophy. Again, I'm cherry picking, and so I'm just kind of trying to pick out some big ideas that come from the history of psychology and philosophy that we're going to actually see direct impacts in as we look at other ideas throughout the course of the capstone semester. So John Stuart Mill is a British associationist in terms of his philosophical approach, and he offers this idea of mental chemistry, that sometimes when we think things are additive, they're really not additive, they're multiplicative, or new things can emerge. So his notion of mental chemistry was that complex ideas come about through more than just simple mental mechanics. And so sometimes A plus B does not end up equaling AB. Sometimes something new and unusual can happen. And so this has really at least two direct impacts on the development of psychological thought. First off, if you're familiar at all with the notion of Gestalt or Gestalt psychology, and we will talk about that later in a different lecture, you might be familiar with the phrase that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That again, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so sometimes when we put things together, even mechanistically, we get something new and different and unusual it's more than just the elements that were combined. And, if you want simple examples of this, you could think about baking. You take the ingredients to make chocolate chip cookies, and it's flour, and it's eggs, and it's chocolate chips, and it's vanilla. Oh, there's some sugar, there's some baking soda, there's some salt in there, and I might have missed a couple things there. And so you've got all of these elements, but when you combine them, you get something new and different that really doesn't resemble at all each of the individual elements, but something new and unusual. And so we take that idea, and John Stuart Mill then, of course, wasn't talking about chocolate chip cookies. He was talking about mental chemistry. And so the thoughts that we have, the ideas that we come up with, are more than just a simple addition and slapping together and combination of ideas. Sometimes combinations can yield more than the sum of what went into it. So that's going to be one influence. Clearly, you see this influence with respect to Gestalt psychology later on. Another influence would be if we look at behaviorism later on, and we look at this notion of formulas and definitions. In fact, an aspect of behaviorism that you may hear of before the semester is over is called SR behaviorism, which stands for stimulus and response. And so a formulaic approach is not unusual. The behaviorists, who were chiefly popular from roughly the 1920s to the 1960s, were very mechanistic and very detailed in their approach of trying to define and use formula or many formulas to define behavior. And so there are these elaborate formulas that emerged about the stimulus, the response, the behavior, the valence that it had, its predictability, its frequency of occurrence, and so forth. And so this idea of defining behaviors, like a physicist might define formulas for force and mass and things like that, do have their impact on the development of historical ideas in psychology. And just one other little notion here is that if you think about statistics and think about interactions, you can have an A main effect, a B main effect, and an A by B interaction. So sometimes variables can combine to yield new and different and unexpected effects that you might not expect from each individual variable alone. And so this idea of mental chemistry is really going to have it's going to have some traction. It's going to have legs, if you will, throughout the development of psychological thought. Kind of coming to the end here of just a very brief overview of early philosophical ideas. Auguste Comte, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, forwarded this notion of positivism, which, and you can see here on the screen, a system based exclusively on facts which are objective and not debatable. That is, you can only be sure of what is observable. And so from a philosophical standpoint, not even psychology at this point in time, but from a philosophical standpoint, this notion of positivism meant that we can only study the stuff that's in front of us, that we can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. And so a positivist has to have it in front of them. It has to be relatively objective. It's not debatable whether it exists or not. It's a physical thing that we can encounter where, and that is the fodder for philosophical study. You can only be sure of what's observable. And so this notion of positivism is a very empirical, evidence-based, research-based approach. And so we wouldn't be thinking about higher mental processes and cognition and things like that because you can't really see cognition. But we can talk about the tears coming out of a tear duct, or we can talk about the volume of voice because we can hear that. Those are relatively objective; they're measurable. You know, it's probably not debatable whether or not there's sound coming out of someone's mouth when they're speaking. It's pretty objective. We can actually get a decibel meter and measure the loudness in terms of decibels. And so this notion of positivism actually plays a pretty big role for psychology later on, because early psychologists are going to go back and forth between being positivistic and not. And probably the classical hardliner positivists would be the behaviorists and the neo-behaviorists, and I'm thinking particularly B.F. Skinner, who we'll talk about later in the course. Cognitive psychologists, by the way, are going to come along and tweak this positivistic approach, and they're going to have a label for it called logical positivism, which means that we can now study things that we can't directly observably see. We can now study those as long as we have good operational definitions. So now I can study things like critical thinking or higher mental processes like problem solving or deduction or insight as long as I operationally define them in such a way where those definitions are now objective and not debatable. And so that tweak from positivism to logical positivism opens the philosophical floodgates, if you will, for the emergence of cognitive psychology, which tends to be thought of as the most dominant approach today, probably along with neuroscience. If we're talking about what's hot in psychology, where psychology is going, cognitive psychology is clearly a predominant paradigm today, as well as a neuroscience approach, really making these brain behavior connections on a very systematic and highly scientific basis. All right, so there you have it. Some early philosophical ideas. Essentially, one of the big issues that we come to here in terms of the early philosophical ideas and how they influenced, in a broad sense, psychology is really the answer to this question: how do we know what we know? So you possess a great deal of knowledge from different experiences, from classes, from a lifetime of living. And so the folks who study these types of things, whether it's the history of psychology historians or just historians in general, philosophers in general, really have two different approaches to how do we know what we know. This is that kind of the René Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And so how do you know what you know? The philosophical approach would be the more reflective, introspective approach, which they have a very special term for, which is called epistemology, or an epistemological approach, is a very philosophical approach to that. To be honest with you, the psychological approach that's in vogue today, or at least in cognitive psychology, would be this notion that you see here of metacognition. And metacognition is a hot area in psychology right now, especially if you're interested in teaching and learning, because you can start to appreciate how important metacognitive processes would be. For example, You're in some other course, you're studying for a test. How do you know when you know enough to take the test? How do you know how long to study and when to stop? When do you know when to terminate your study? How does that relate to the confidence that you have about your knowledge? You might know, but you might end up guessing on a multiple choice test. And so these are really important notions to psychologists, cognitive psychologists in general, and even in particular, those folks who are interested in teaching and learning and pedagogy and education. And so these are pretty big, broad, important questions that psychologists continue to study to this day. All right, that's our conclusion of our big, broad approach to laying a foundation of a historical background. We'll certainly talk about specific philosophers in more detail as we move towards the launching of the discipline of psychology. Thanks for listening.